Right, hello there, Headington Economics. So, as I said to you in class, I don't really want to burn another lesson going through feedback for the exam because I just need to get on and do some more teaching of new material. So instead of going through it in class, I'm going to attempt to give you feedback through this video. So, things you should have to hand, your script, okay, like that one. And the mark schemes that I've sent to you, and anything else that I gave you in class, whether that's kind of exemplar answers or anything else that I might have given you. So if we turn over and we talk to, we start talking about question one. Question one was a simple knowledge question. Had you revised it or not? Different roles of the central bank, not including interest rates or quantitative easing. So don't tell me about interest rates, don't tell me about monetary policy, don't tell me about the aim of having inflation at 2%, because that is essentially setting interest rates in order to have an effect on the economy. Particular things that I'm looking for would include things like being the government's bank, and by that I mean it's the depositor of government revenue, and it gives a government a banking facility. But the thing you should be aware of is that the central bank doesn't loan the government money. Hypothetically, I guess it could, but it doesn't. It never has, and certainly in the UK. So those of you that said that the central bank loans the government money, that's not right. The government raises its finance either through tax revenue or by selling bonds, not through the central bank. Other roles for the central bank? Well, the Bank of England is the regulator of the financial sector in the UK. So that means it does inspections, it makes sure that commercial banks comply with the law. It is the holder of the nation's treasure, and by that I mean it keeps the nation's gold reserves and it keeps the nation's foreign currency. Some of you said that it is in control of exchange rates. Well, firstly, in the UK we have a floating exchange rate, so nobody's in control of the exchange rate. And second of all, that's not really a role of the central bank. It's an impact of their monetary policy that it might have an effect on exchange rates, but that's not really their role, as it were. Another role of the central bank is to collect data on the economy and to publish that data on the economy such that people can look at their data and assess whether or not the economy is doing well in terms of inflation and GDP. So I've given you four different ones there. The government's bank, the regulator of the financial sector, the other one I just gave you, and another one would be the lender of last resort to commercial banks. So commercial banks can have a bank account with the central bank as well. Okay, so there's plenty there. Look, that's all in your textbook. You just need to open the textbook and have a look at that one. The one part B, using an ADAS diagram. There was one person who didn't draw an ADAS diagram, everybody else did, so well done them. Outline is another word for explain, so no need for an evaluation. How a sharp depreciation of sterling can cause inflation despite weak aggregate demand. So if you read the data again, this is all about how the economy is only just getting over a recession and there's very weak aggregate demand. So my question was, how can we have inflation even though there's this large output gap, even though AD is quite far along the AS curve? So I wasn't really looking for the answer that depreciation of sterling will make exports more competitive and imports less competitive, and therefore AD will shift to the right, creating demand pull inflation. That's not really what's going on here, because AD might shift to the right, but it's unlikely to lead to inflation because, as it says in this text, there's a very large output gap. Instead, what's happening, because there's a devaluation of the or depreciation of the sterling, that's creating cost push inflation. And the way we show cost push inflation is an upwards shift of the horizontal part of the Keynesian AS curve, or if you were doing classical economics, you'd do as a leftward shift of the SRAS curve. Okay, so I did give some credit for demand pull inflation, but I only gave 2 marks out of 4 for that. I really wanted an explanation of cost push inflation for 4 marks. Part C. To what extent will a policy of quantitative easing always lead to an increase in aggregate demand? 8 marks. So the first thing you should be realising there is it's a to what extent question, which means you've got to do two sides of the argument. So in terms of exam technique, you should really now be at the stage where you're looking at that saying, well, the one side of the argument is saying QE does lead to AD increasing, and the other side of the argument is saying it doesn't, or it doesn't lead to very much AD increasing. A lot of you just simply didn't do the evaluation here. Quantitative easing needs to be explained in full. So quantitative easing is when the central bank prints money, prints new electronic money, and then systematically buys bonds from bondholders. It doesn't buy them from the government, it buys them from people who have previously bought government bonds, so we can call them bondholders. And these can be firms, they can be banks, they can be individuals and households. And what's happening there is they are turning illiquid assets, that's the bond, into a liquid asset, which is cash. So nobody's getting any richer, it's just that the bondholder, instead of now having a bond, has cash. And they hope, therefore, that when people have cash, the individuals amongst us with our cash will spend more, consumption will go up. If they're banks, that they will lend more, investment will go up. Or if firms, they will have more available cash and they will invest that as well. So if consumption and investment are going up, AD will increase. If you were to make that point with a good explanation of what QE is, then I was happy to give you 5 out of the 8 marks. Okay. However, it is an evaluate question or a to what extent question. So there's another 3 marks there. And those 3 marks are for saying something like, even though QE should work like this, there are some reasons why it might not. And some of those reasons might include things like low consumer confidence. In this particular data, we were talking about just coming out of a recession, so you could easily argue that consumer confidence is low, and if people have more cash, they won't just spend it, they'll probably save it because they're worried about their job security. Or you could talk about the real life of this, which is that banks got the money and they didn't lend it to consumers because they themselves were worried about their debt, and therefore they kept their money and paid back the debt rather than lending it on. Or you could say something like it depends on the extent to which quantitative easing is happening. If you're going to say that, you better develop that and say, look, if it's not a huge amount of QE, then this isn't going to make a large difference in the economy. You know, if it's only a couple of million, then that won't have any effect on AD because AD is 2 trillion in the UK. So there's your evaluation points that you could have had. D, what is meant by productivity? Right, I've gone through that in class. Productivity is total output over total input. So normally people would do total output over total labour, or it could be total output over total machines or something like that. E, with reference to extract B and economic theory, discuss the extent to which high quality education and training programmes can improve the trade balance and reduce unemployment in levels in the UK. Right, I actually really like this question because it tells you exactly what you need to do. You need to talk about education and training programs and whether or not they can really have a realistic impact on the trade balance and can they really reduce unemployment. It's a it's a discuss question, which means you have to do 2 sides of the argument. Great. On the one hand, it improves the trade balance. On the other hand, it doesn't. On the one hand, it reduces unemployment. On the other hand, it doesn't. And it's as easy as that. And as long as you're also dropping in some points about the UK and Wales or the Global Competitive Report, then you'll also get your application marks. So my answer to this would be something like high quality education and training gives people more skills. It improves the human capital of your labour. It increases productivity of labour. As a result of productivity going up, that reduces costs of production for firms, exports become more competitive, exports should increase, thereby improving the trade balance. Doesn't necessarily mean we'll suddenly have a trade surplus, but it should certainly improve it. And that's a chain of argument that takes you all the way from people becoming more skilled and suddenly having an impact on exports, imports, and the trade balance in general. On the other hand, it may not have a very big impact on the trade balance because in the UK we're a net importer and therefore we could increase exports a bit, but they'd still be outweighed by imports. We might export something that's very inelastic. So even if the price goes down, we won't make very many more sales, so the actual revenue coming into the country won't increase by very much at all. Or, education and training take a long time, and therefore we might not see the impact for a long time. Don't just leave it as it takes a long time. Tell me why that matters. It takes a long time, so although it might improve the trade balance, that might be 10 years down the line. With regards to unemployment then, I would say something like, because the labour now has more skills, greater productivity, that means that they are more attractive to firms to hire them. Or you could do it in terms of a substitution effect. So in comparison to machinery, humans are now more productive and firms are more willing to hire them. I would like to see you make reference to something like occupational immobility or structural unemployment. Yeah, there are lots of job vacancies in the UK in the moment in engineering and in high-tech industries. So by giving people a greater education and training in those industries, therefore they're more likely to fill the gaps that are available in the country. And there's some data in that in extract B. On the other hand, it may not reduce unemployment levels if there is no AD in the country. If demand is low, just because people are skilled doesn't mean that suddenly they'll get jobs if there's no demand. On the other hand, if the education and training schemes are not particularly effective, if the government doesn't spend a lot of money on it, doesn't get the right teachers, then maybe these people aren't actually as skilled as they should have been. On the other hand, education and training schemes take a long time, and by the time these people have qualified to be engineers, maybe we don't need engineers anymore, and what we need is plumbers. So therefore the education and training scheme didn't solve the unemployment problem that we had right at the time. I think the key with this is just to make sure that you're doing what the question asks you to do, which is to evaluate all the way along. And any time you make a point, on the one hand, you need to, a good habit to get into would be to immediately evaluate it. Immediately give me a reason why the argument you just made isn't right, or doesn't quite work, or why in certain circumstances it doesn't work. So your answer should look something like, it improves the trade balance, it doesn't improve the trade balance. It improves unemployment, it doesn't improve unemployment. And if you've got more than one argument either way, put it all in, shoehorn it all in, okay? As long as you've got time, put it all in. If one of it's wrong, then it doesn't matter because the rest of it's right. There's no negative marking here, so just keep writing as long as you're not going over the kind of 10-minute allocation for a 10-mark question. Big mistake with 1E was people just not evaluating, taking loads of time telling me why the trade balance might improve and while it won't reduce unemployment, and by the time they've done it, they've forgotten that they had to evaluate. If you don't evaluate on that question, the maximum amount of marks you can get is 6. You've already lost 4 marks. 1F. All right, this is causing some problems. So, mental note to myself, I need to do something a little bit on supply side policies with you. Okay? But the clue is in the title about supply side policies. Cutting direct taxes and improving infrastructure, is that better at reducing inflation than interest rates? So the best way to do this question is to talk about how supply side policies will reduce inflation and then evaluate that. Tell me why they might not be very good. And then on the other hand, tell me why interest rates are very good at reducing inflation, and then tell me why they're not so great at reducing inflation. And therefore, again, you're getting all the evaluative marks and you're getting the analysis marks because you can see the economic logic going one way and the other way. So, for example, in this case, let's start with the monetary policy one because that's easy for all of you. Okay, increasing interest rates will increase the reward for saving. It will make borrowing more expensive, and it will also push the exchange rate up because more people will want to save in UK banks, all of which means that there will be a decrease in consumption, a decrease in investment, and a decrease in exports. AD is going down, and if AD goes down, then there is deflationary pressure and you should solve inflation. Job done. On the other hand, it depends on the extent to which interest rates have changed. If it's only a 0.25% increase, then it won't have much effect on the economy. If we're living in an economic boom time, just because interest rates excuse me, are going up, doesn't mean that suddenly we'll all start saving our money. We're feeling quite frivolous. House prices are going up. People are feeling the wealth effect, so it doesn't really matter if interest rates are going up. There's all sorts of reasons why the interest rate thing might not reduce inflation. If we're too far above full employment, whilst we might reduce inflation a little bit, it doesn't reduce inflation by very much. Now on to the direct taxes and infrastructure. The clue is with the supply side policy bit. So I know you're all thinking direct taxes, income taxes decrease AD. Stop. I'm interested in the supply side element. If you decrease income taxes, that's an incentive to work. More people want to work. Think about the people who aren't working, the people that work to watch Jeremy Kyle on their sofa every morning. Okay? If you reduce income taxes, then you're essentially increasing real wages, you're essentially increasing the incentive to work. AS will shift to the right. If the government spends money on infrastructure, that reduces transportation costs. That is a capital good in and of itself. That will encourage greater investment from other companies because they can now use the bridges and the highways and all the other things, the infrastructure things that we're building. That will shift AS to the right. A supply side policy is a policy that shifts the long run aggregate supply to the right. If you shift aggregate supply to the right, that will have a deflationary impact. You don't have to shift AD to do this, just practice it yourself on a diagram now. Okay, an AD curve there is shifting aggregate supply that way to the right. You will see there is deflationary pressure in the economy. So supply side policies are quite good at reducing inflation or creating deflationary pressure because of the fact that they shift AS curve to the right. That's your one side to the argument. That's the economic theory bit done. On the other hand, it is possible that in the short run, these policies of spending money, decreasing income tax, that will actually shift AD and that might create some inflationary pressure in the short run. That's a good evaluative point. On the other hand, infrastructure takes a long time to work. There is a possibility of malinvestment, that we build the wrong infrastructure that actually doesn't help the economy at all and doesn't push the AS curve to the right as much as we intended. The direct taxes depend on the extent to which we reduce direct taxes. There's all those evaluating points as well. And then I think for a 12-mark question, you are looking for some sort of conclusion. I think that, well, okay, I'll give you my own view. I think that actually, if I want to reduce inflation now, I better use interest rates. That's going to be far more direct and far more effective than building some, infrastructure of network project, which probably takes me 10 years to do. It's going to have a whole lot of bureaucracy and it's going to cost the government a load of money, which they don't really have. Yeah, I'll do the indirect taxes one. So again, with that, where did people go wrong? Well, a lot of people just didn't acknowledge the supply side element of infrastructure direct taxes. A lot of people then didn't evaluate between the two of them. So they did the rise in interest rates bit, but then they didn't tell me why a rise in interest rates might not work. And very, very few people actually did a conclusion at the end and gave me any sort of judgment. For a 12-mark question, I think you deserve to give the examiner a judgment on what you think. All right, so that's question 1, okay? And then I'm going to do another video now for question 2.